Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Before the Beginning, episode 28. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 25. So let's go ahead and hop right into it, shall we? He says, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Now, this is a common way to make an argument. They would assume, of course, that God's wisdom is all-knowing. They would consume that his power is all-powerful. And so to say that the foolishness of God is wiser than men is basically just saying that God on a bad day is better than you on a good day, and God doesn't have any bad days, right? So he's saying anytime you think that you're approaching God through your own wisdom, anytime that you think that you're approaching God through your own strength, you're nowhere close. Why? Because before the foundation of the world, before the world ever even began, God had a plan in mind already to reconcile the world to himself, which means that there's nothing that the citizens of the world can do to reconcile themselves to God, because God already has the plan. He's already got it figured out. He already knows what he's going to do. And you can't overturn that to the positive, and you can't overturn that to the negative. God already has that in place. Now, what you can do is close your eyes to it and walk as if it's not true, in which case the book of Matthew and all the different parables describes what life looks like in that scenario. It describes life like walking around in darkness, like walking around in torture, like walking around in fire, like walking around in some kind of self-inflicted punishment, because that's what life is like, living apart from your true self, living apart from your true reality, which is relationship with God. And so he says in verse 26, for consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the base things of the world, and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. So Paul says, consider yourself. How many of you might consider yourselves wise? How many of you might consider yourselves mighty? How many of you might consider yourselves noble? Instead, you probably think of yourself as foolish or weak, he says. Maybe you think yourself as shameful or not worthy, or somehow degraded in some way or despised in some way. He says, don't count yourself those things, because God has chosen you anyways. God has chosen you despite yourself, and it was according to the good pleasure of his will. So if you're here and you think, well, I'm not as good as him, or I'm not as good as her, then that's only going to produce division. And that's exactly what was happening in the church of Corinth. They were trying to measure their worth based on everything but the cross of Christ. They were trying to measure their worth based on who baptized them. Well, I was baptized by Paul, or I was baptized by Apollos, or who their favorite teacher was. I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. He says, no, you're of Christ. Paul wasn't crucified for you. Peter wasn't resurrected for you. Only Christ was, which puts you all at equal ground. That's why I told them to speak the same thing in chapter 1. He wanted them to all say they're of Christ. In chapter 8, they were having arguments about idols. And Paul says, look, the only thing that matters is love. It's not about your knowledge. Up here, it's about your love. Then you'll know as you ought to know. He says in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, look, it's not about what gift you have. It's not about whether you can speak in tongues, whether you can prophesy, whether you can interpret, whatever. All that really ultimately matters is love, because without love, all of this is null and void. You see what he's doing here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 is he's saying, stop applying these labels of greatness or strength or power or wisdom to yourself, and take on for yourself the wisdom, the power, and the strength of God. Because listen to what he says in the very next passage, verses 30 and 31. But by his doing, this is what he had planned from before the beginning. You are in Christ Jesus. Why? Because you've been reconciled to me through the cross. And Jesus, he became to us. You ready? He became to us wisdom from God, and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So just as it is written, let him who boasts boast in the Lord. Stop boasting in yourself. God had you from the beginning. He knew you from your mother's womb. He knew you before you were even born. And it was his eternal plan to reconcile you to himself. Stop doubting yourself. Stop doubting that you are chosen, that you are called, that you're predestined, that you're loved, that you're worthy. Stop doubting those things, because the eternal I am trumps any of your I am nots, as a Baxter Kruger would say. So don't boast in yourself. Boast in God, because he's the one that's done the reconciling, and he's committed unto us this ministry of reconciliation. Okay, let's move into chapter 2. He says, and when I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. I didn't come to you in any of these categories. So why are you thinking that any of this stuff matters? We're talking about the preordained plan of God. We're not talking about how good of a speaker Paul is. He says, in fact, the only thing I determined to know among you, in verse 2, is Jesus Christ and him crucified. Nothing else. It's not about me. It's not about what I can do. It's not about what I think. The only thing I want you to see is Jesus on the cross. Because once you get that, everything else falls into place. Once you get the selfless, sacrificial, kenotic love of God, everything else falls into place. The love of Christ will control you. The love of Christ will constrain you. The love of Christ will lead you to where you need to go, because it's Christ who lives in you. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. So the only thing that I wanted you to know is Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's it. Because this right here, Jesus Christ and him crucified, the word, the logos of the cross, verse 18, the word of the cross, what he preached, verse 23, this is the thing that was known from before the ages. This is the thing that was known from before the beginning, the cross of Christ, which means nothing else matters in comparison to that. Okay? He says in verse 3, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith will not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. See, God didn't send you the most eloquent speaker. God didn't send you a guy with a bunch of sheet charts and syllogisms and, a good PowerPoint presentation. What God sent you was a man who had nothing for himself but everything for Christ, who had counted all things for loss for the sake of the upward calling of God. This is a man who only cared about what the Spirit had to say. And the only thing that the Spirit had to say was Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's it. That's all that matters. That's the only thing that matters in the whole world. Because once you understand that the cross is a perfect depiction of God's love for us, it's not a demonstration of wrath in a sense. That is wrath from the Father onto the Son. It's a demonstration of God's wrath against sin and darkness and death and decay. And that's what Jesus was battling against. He was judging the prince of the world and casting him out through the cross. But the cross is a demonstration towards us of God's love, towards the people who the serpent manipulated into serving him. Jesus has demonstrated God's love. His enemies, sinners, the unrighteous, the ungodly, according to Romans 5. He says, this is what I've come to preach, because this is the message that has been coming from the Father's heart since before the beginning of the world. Jesus said, I can only do the things that I've seen my Father do, in the book of John. And so when he went to the cross, the only reason he did that is because that's what he had seen the Father do over and over and over again from before the beginning. Because Jesus says that I've come, this is John 17, I've come to make known to you the love that the Father has had towards me from before the foundation of the world. Because God is relationship. God is love. The relationship between the Father, Son, and the Spirit is what we know as what we call God. And that's what was predestined. That's why Jesus went to the cross. Okay. In the next video, we're going to pick it up there in verse 6. See you then. God bless.